Before we start, I have a couple of quick ground rules. One, we hope we don't need to do this, but in case there's an emergency, we have a exit door here. We also obviously have doors in the back. The general procedure here would be to go over to the National Geographic Society, which if you haven't been over there, they've got great exhibits right now on the Titanic, and then one on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So, and a good cafeteria for that matter as well. Also, you should have a card on your seat. Please fill it out if you have a question, and we have folks here that will take questions over the course of this session. So please pass them. Charlie, you here, or where's Nick? Is Nick here? Okay, so we've got other folks. So feel free to write your questions down, and we'll take them and read them from the front. I'm joined here on stage. Before I introduce the Commissioner, I'm joined on stage by Andrew Shearer. He's Senior Advisor on Asia Pacific Security at CSIS and Director of the Alliances and American Leadership Project. Andrew has served multiple positions within the Australian government, including National Security Advisor to Prime Ministers John Howard and Tony Abbott. So thanks for coming as well. And just briefly, you have his bio, but a warm welcome to Andrew Colvin. He's the Commissioner of the Australian Federal Police and is a career police officer. So joined the AFP in 1990. It's about the last time that the city of Washington, before this year, won a major sports event. So that gives you a sense of the timing we're talking about. His background and what'll be useful in not just his comments, but in the discussion, his background has ranged everything from serious and organized crime, narcotics, money laundering, counterterrorism, terrorist financing, and politically motivated crime. So it's a wide variety of issues he has covered. One last comment that I've noted that you're really ahead of me at this point, and is you're a more active tweeter than I am right now. So kudos to that. You've joined the social media forum, certainly more than I have. So welcome to CSIS. We're also online as well, and this will be if you want to rewatch it, this will be on the CSIS website, the video portion of it. So over to you, and thank you for coming to CSIS.
Well, good morning, everybody. I think it's still morning. Seth, thank you very much for those comments, and Andrew, it's great to see you as well. Andrew knows all the questions I don't want to get asked from his time as National Security Advisor. So I'll wait with bated breath to see what he has to say. And Seth, yes, I wouldn't say an avid tweeter, and I'm yet to work out whether the abuse that I cop on Twitter is worth the effort of actually tweeting. But I think it's an important part of what we do in law enforcement is that community outreach. Look, can I say right up front, thank you very much to CSIS for inviting me to come here. It's about 10 years since I last visited CSIS, didn't get the opportunity then to speak, so this is fantastic and I really do appreciate it. I've got a few colleagues from my time at the Kennedy School as well, so Chris, and I think there might be a few others as well, but I haven't seen everybody. Oh yeah, Nick, there's Nick. Thank you very much for coming along, guys, and supporting me here today. I think I've been told by my staff too, I do have to mention the capitals, of course. What I didn't realise is it's 28 years since DC last won a national sporting competition. However, I do think it's only because you have an Australian in the team, Nathan Walker, so we will claim a little bit of the credit for that. But congratulations to DC and congratulations to the Capitals. So I have a few prepared remarks, and then what I'm really keen to do is get into some question and answer and hear from the audience, as well as obviously Seth and Andrew about what they'd like me to talk about. A little bit about the Australian Federal Police first, though. The AFP, as I'll call it throughout today, is the principal international representative of Australia's policing efforts. And as Commissioner, suffice to say, I'm very proud of the efforts of the men and women of the AFP across a range of fronts, as we strive on our stated mission to make Australia a safer place. We're a progressive and a very multifaceted law enforcement organisation that we would say, and I believe, is taking a strong lead in the fight against 21st century crime. We're not a big organisation though. We're, by American standards, US standards, we're quite a small organisation. 6,500 officers spread across around 30 countries in the world, But we have a very, very broad remit, and that remit, quite unusually for law enforcement, covers community policing, so at the domestic, local level, as well as our national responsibilities and our international responsibilities. And it won't surprise any of you today that a lot of my comments and remarks will be more towards those international responsibilities, which is what we struggle with. Transnational serious organised crime, victim-based crime, human trafficking, terrorism, increasingly some of the more politically difficult challenges we have around countering foreign interference and counter-espionage are all parts of what we do, with a huge focus, obviously, on terrorism and violent extremism. Now, I'm the first to say that policing is not just about seeking prosecutions. We employ the principles of prevention, deterrence, partnership and innovation in everything that we do. We strive to build a more secure future, not just for Australia, but for our global partners as well. And our commitment to international relations drives that interagency collaboration and enables transnational crime to be tackled wherever it is. We work on a principle that if we can secure our near neighbours, then that's a good thing for Australia. If we can close down vulnerabilities that they might have, then that makes Australia a much safer place. The AFP has built an extensive international liaison network, and it's a cornerstone of our organisation. Put simply, our efforts to cripple transnational and serious organised crime would be futile without it. Right at the moment, we have about 240 staff located in 33 countries around the world. So for a small organisation, that's a large investment. We have 152 involved in missions to build the capacity and stabilisation of some of our near neighbours, and we have just under 80 people who are international liaison officers around the world. So why do we have such a focus on working internationally? Well, it's simple really. It's because organised crime groups exploit the same conditions that lead to state failure and fragility, and we're seeing that increasingly each and every day. This includes the risks of corruption, supply chain exploitation, illicit drug manufacture, cybercrime, people smuggling, human trafficking, and of course, the ever-present risk of terrorism. Australia's position as a destination for many crime types, particularly cross-border controlled drugs, where we spend, well, per capita, we are one of the highest users of illicit drugs in the world, if not the highest. And the price of drugs in Australia is as much as 10 times it is here in North America or Central America. So there's huge profit margins. We estimate that about 70% of Australia's serious criminal threats have an international dimension. That's right, nearly over 2/3 of those crimes impacting Australia either emanate from offshore or have a significant link to the offshore environment. And when we consider the complexity of international law, the differing legal systems that exist, the speed at which technology is fast outpacing our trusted international legal frameworks, it should be no surprise that our investigations are complex, they're protracted, and they're very challenging. Now, one such example of this complexity is the exponential increase in data collected through investigations, and this has placed heavier demands on our specialists and our support capabilities than ever before. One recent counter-terrorism investigation saw the seizure of 46 terabytes of data off suspect devices. Now, for the layman like me that wonders just how big a terabyte is, that's equivalent to 12.3 billion pieces of paper, or 12.3 billion pages, or 24.6 million reams of paper. You'd need about 1,326 semi-trailer trucks to carry all of that. The data analytics and the digital forensics requirement are enormous, and that's just one investigation. And of course, we carry the risk that in any of that data, if there's anything that signals an intent to cause harm, then that risk sits with the organisation. It's not just that complexity, though, that ties up our resources, it's volume. In 2017, the AFP and our partner agencies, both foreign and domestic, seized approximately 7 tonnes of cocaine, 2.5 tonnes of meth in Australian waters, or what we believed was headed for Australia. In fact, cocaine seizures have come from far away as Panama, Mexico, Peru, South Africa, China, just to name a few. Our operations are not always a one-off seizure. They may continue for several years. An example of this is Operation Akesi, which commenced in July 2014 and resulted in investigations in Fiji, Tahiti, Colombia, as well as at home in Australia. This operation has since resulted in 18 arrests and 3 separate large-scale seizures of heroin and cocaine. But it's not just bulk cocaine shipments that reach our shores. Intelligence from Australia was shared with the DEA, and despite the criminals using encrypted phones to communicate and dealing largely in cash, our international relationships and well-researched intelligence led to the multiple arrests and the seizure of $2.4 million in cash and 255 kilograms of ice, which had an estimated street value of $250 million. This seizure happened before the drugs had even left the US. So again, another example of taking the battle to its core. These results are only possible due to our good police-to-police working relationships. Intelligence sharing and early communication with our international partners is essential for this continued success. Now, at this point, let me say this. In the grand scheme of things, we all know that this is just another seizure. We know that illicit drugs are prevalent on our streets in the US and certainly prevalent on our streets in Australia. But these criminals are not simply drug traffickers, as insidious as that would be if that's all they were. They're money launderers, they're identity thieves, they undermine our borders, our health networks, they fuel volume crimes affecting every individual in Australia, and frankly, they present problems to all aspects of society. I'm happy to say that in Australia, organised crime has been recognised as a national security issue, and that's because it undermines our economy and our economic stability. For example, organised crime in Australia has been estimated to cost in the order of $36 billion annually. Now, frankly, we think that's probably an underestimation, but it's a conservative based on the figures that we can see. The UN Office of Drugs and Crime has estimated that criminals launder about 2.7% of the world's GDP. That's huge. We know there are money laundering organisations who are servicing the movements of billions of dollars in proceeds of crime for organised crime groups all over the world. These organisations are multi-jurisdictional, highly organised and extremely skilled in what they do. More often than not, they are completely separate from the traditional organised crime networks that we understand. They offer professional money laundering services so that organised crime groups can outsource their risk and outsource the laundering to someone at arm's length. These organisations are frequently established in countries with weak anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing laws, and they have high opportunity for corruption. They take advantage of these vulnerabilities to operate free from heavy regulation and free from enforcement. An example of this that some of you may be aware of was the Kanani money laundering network that alone was responsible for laundering billions of dollars for organised crime groups across the globe, probably one of the 6 biggest individual money laundering organisations that we've identified. Now, it was halted due to a collaborative effort between Australia and US agencies, and Kanani was prosecuted, and more importantly, his organisation was designated by the US Treasury Department Office of Foreign Asset Control. Now, I'll change tack for a minute and talk a little bit about police-led diplomacy and Southeast Asia. The importance of the AFP's role as an agency that can provide leadership and coordination role on serious crime and national security is growing. So with this in mind, I'd like to touch on what police-led diplomacy is, because I think it's currently a little bit of an unknown and something that we are promoting very heavily. Our role offshore will always be principally security and investigation focused. We are still a police force at the end of the day. We're not Foreign Affairs and we're not the State Department. But the concept of police-led diplomacy, taking advantage of what we have in common rather than what separates us as nations, is an important byproduct of the work that we do. The call on our resources to assist in the development of policing in Australia's nearby region will continue, if not get larger. Policing expertise and community engagement will increasingly be important in helping manage instability in many regional countries. Climate change and more intense weather patterns will disproportionately affect fragile states, many in our region of Asia and the South Pacific. And it's likely to lead to requirements for the AFP to contribute to humanitarian assistance on a far more frequent scale. We will need to continue to evolve and build upon our international relationships, particularly in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, to grow our law enforcement cooperation and build capabilities across the region, but also to advance broader Australian government initiatives. Ultimately, this makes Australia a safer place. Now, that doesn't mean that we will lead all the efforts or that our role will be high profile. In fact, I'd often prefer that it not be high profile. But as crime is borderless, and the AFP is uniquely placed to bring together the effort of law enforcement in this space, and our partners here are crucial to the success, as they are increasingly asking us to fill that leadership role. Our relationship with Indonesian National Police has for many years delivered outcomes that benefit both Australia and Indonesia's interests. This has been a resilient and a continuous relationship despite the somewhat rocky road that we sometimes travel diplomatically. Even more importantly though, It's often been the catalyst for our broader bilateral relationship to get back on track when we have hit those rocky diplomatic times. The concept of police-led diplomacy is simple. It utilises law enforcement links to build upon and find common bilateral and diplomatic ground. Put simply, there are few countries that don't agree and share a common objective to defeat terrorism, to defeat the abuse of children, to curb the flow of drugs, money or guns. And we need to use these obvious common factors amongst us all to our advantage in assisting in creating interest and assisting with other cases that some countries may not prioritise as highly as our own. Now, I want to turn briefly to cybercrime. Cybercrime is truly one of the largest asymmetric threats that we face as a policing organisation, frankly, as we face as countries. The interconnectedness of digital communication and physical hardware has well and truly extended the reach of crime. Millions and millions of new victims are opening themselves up each and every day to this crime. Not only can individuals carry out new types of crime, but they can do so from a distance and with far greater scale. A lone actor armed with malware can commit a crime against millions of people in multi-jurisdictions in very little time at all. Excuse me. Now, when I started my policing career 28 years ago, as Seth said, internet crime involving hacking, malicious viruses, money laundering scams, online trafficking in goods or people, cyber stalking, cyber terrorism simply didn't exist. In fact, we were feeling our way in simply using computers to do our job. Now criminals are able to perpetrate crimes such as child abuse, including the active targeting of vulnerable children via anonymised use of internet and virtual currencies, and theft in these virtual environments. In essence, the cyber realm has opened up a pool of victims exponentially that were never exposed to crime before. The AFP is continually working to adapt its current practices to maintain an effective presence in this virtual criminal environment through embracing the new methodologies and the new technology. And while we're talking about technology, let me say this. Technology is presenting a challenge to governments like almost never before. We can't regulate it. We can't legislate it. We have to work with it. It's a realm we simply must find a way to work with industry if we are to be successful. It's a realm that the private sector own that we have to find a way to work with them. The future world will be more convenient and responsive to people's needs, but there is a trade-off, of course, between convenience and the vulnerability that we expose ourselves through these connected devices. Industry experts estimate that the Internet of Things will consist of almost 50 billion objects by 2020, just a few short years away. This world offers incredible opportunities, but also exposes society to increased vulnerabilities, many of which haven't yet been identified. Most of them we probably can't imagine. In fact, it's been estimated that 92% of current systems have a known vulnerability. That's your phones, that's your desks on your computer, it's your kids' iPads. The introduction of autonomous and AI systems will also give rise to complex new legal frameworks and ethical challenges that we haven't turned our mind to yet. Criminals will be quick to adopt automated technologies which will test our traditional policing approaches. In fact, they are very quick to adopt technologies while we are very slow to change our ways. Individual privacy will face unprecedented challenges, and protecting it will become a significant issue for individuals and governments. Anyone can download or buy pre-made malicious software packages online and get tips on YouTube on how to deploy them and how to make money out of them. A single operator can carry out multiple simultaneous attacks. A drone is capable of carrying an improvised explosive device. Driverless cars can deliver improvised explosive devices. An algorithm can set up phishing scams that steal banking information and skim fractional amounts from millions of accounts so that it's unnoticeable, but in totality is huge. The reality is that these complex problems do not always respond well to our traditional policing solutions. And to some degree, we will always be playing catch up to the rapid developments of cyber and technology. Now, this is not easy as an organisation more accustomed to structure, to process, to rules, to precedent, to law, to legislation. We have to change the way we think. But without changing our own methodology and accepting the risk that comes with that change, we'll never even get close, and we won't be able to serve the communities as we should. Now, let me touch on encryption for a moment. Prolific growth in the use of encryption technology is an everyday reality for our investigators, and we can't afford this to remain an obstacle. As such, we need integration of that traditional and that non-traditional capabilities, technical capabilities, in order to make sure that criminals cannot confidently hide behind the reach of law enforcement. Now, this is a controversial area, I know. As a father and as a member of society, I use encryption. I want my kids to use encryption, but we need to understand the risks that are involved. Encryption and the darknet will result in crimes involving multiple systems, actors and technologies across jurisdictions. Commercial encryption and mobile virtual network operators assist criminal logistics by making the transactional and the transnational movement of value and digitised goods difficult to detect. And for such borderless crime, the AFP works closely with its international partners again. For example, it was alleged that the Canadian-based agency Phantom Secure, that some of you may have recently read about, specifically designed mobile devices for the organised crime market, using technology that facilitates unrestricted, secure and encrypted communications. The company's network infrastructure and its clientele were located across many, many countries. But unfortunately, Australia was the largest customer base of Phantom Secure. We had an estimated over 10,000 Phantom Secure devices sold and used since the company first appeared in Australia around 2009, 2010. Now, in March this year, the AFP, in conjunction with some of our partners, particularly here in the US, executed 19 search warrants on premises across 4 jurisdictions under one unified operation. More than 1,000 encrypted devices were seized. 5 men, including Phantom Secure's CEO, were indicted in the US, and 1 was charged in Australia. This joint action will have significant and sustained impact on the organised crime market globally. But we're not naive and we're not ignorant. They'll just find another platform. So we need to keep innovating and we need to keep doing this work. The need for cooperation with international partners will only be greater when failed states or states with a weak rule of law are involved, and that's what we're starting to see increasingly. Now, shortly, the Australian Government will be introducing legislation to strengthen the ability of intelligence agencies and law enforcement to adapt to encryption by ensuring that companies that provide communication services and devices in Australia have an obligation to assist law enforcement agencies. It's controversial, but let me be clear. This is not an attempt by government or the AFP or our intelligence partners to mandate backdoors into people's messages or an attempt at mass surveillance. This is about targeted access to information in accordance with in accordance with a warrant gained for a lawful purpose. Criminals and terrorists must not be allowed to use encrypted messages to hide online. Our investigators must have the tools they need to investigate serious crimes and combat these threats to national security. Let me change tack again and talk quickly about foreign interference. We've been actively engaged with the development of an Australian espionage and foreign interference bill that's working its way through the Parliament at the moment. It's designed to make Australia a less permissive operating environment for foreign actors who seek to undermine Australia's democratic processes and our national security. Now, if passed, the bill will modernise and include new and amended laws for espionage, foreign interference, sabotage, theft of trade secrets and other offences against the government. Quite frankly, our legislation in Australia was terribly outdated. The new suite of offences available to the AFP and our partner agencies will make prosecution a far more viable option and will afford opportunity to investigate and prosecute a range of conduct, including the opportunity, of course, for early intervention where we can. And by and large, this new work with the AFP will necessitate us developing an even greater understanding of the complex nature of how state actors are now operating in a crime environment. So it won't be easy, and we've got our challenges. I'm going to quickly talk now about counter-terrorism, and then we'll look at some questions. But I can't come this far and not talk about terrorism. I haven't talked about it so far, not because it's not important. It is important. In fact, it's our greatest priority. But I didn't talk about it because sometimes I worry that it overshadows the other work that we do. And sometimes I worry that it is taken as the only issue we have to worry about, when in fact organised crime and transnational crime is becoming so much more pervasive. As Australia's primary law enforcement agency, we straddle that international and domestic environment, often becoming the bridge between events overseas in other parts of the world and the impact that they have locally. We traverse the top secret and the public worlds, and often we are the public's face of Australia's national efforts to keep our communities safe. Australia's identity is defined by an overriding commitment to our nation and its democratic values, not by race, not by ethnicity, not by religion. We are a proud multicultural country, but that does not render us immune from the threat of terrorism. Terrorism, of course, is a global challenge. I don't need to tell people here that. And we work closely with our international partners, both in the region and beyond. And I recognise that we cannot entirely eliminate the risk of terrorism any more than we can eliminate the risk of any of the serious crimes I've just talked about, but we can mitigate it. And we mitigate these threats by looking at their causes, including instability, both at home and abroad. Interstate and intrastate conflict with regional consequences and large-scale unregulated migration are amongst the top 5 most likely risks to global security. A strong nexus exists between transnational organised crime and terrorism, and this is most apparent in the services offered by those professional money launderers that I've already mentioned. Rather than looking at where terrorist and organised crime activities coincide, which consumes a lot of our focus, a strong focus of global law enforcement is now on money laundering, as this strikes at the ability of all crime types, including terrorism, to further their activities. The economic impact of global terrorism has been rising steadily since 2010. The Institute for Economics and Peace calculated its cost at more than $52 billion in 2014. That's still 4 years ago. From the Al-Qaeda attacks in New York that we're all very familiar with to Daesh's sophisticated use of media to radicalise individuals, terrorists have proven adept at using cutting-edge technology. They communicate more effectively and securely than we do. They publish propaganda, they transfer funds, and they undertake reconnaissance securely and remotely. They operate just like an organised crime group. And while we know that Daesh is losing ground and influence in the Middle East, I can assure you it gives law enforcement very little room for comfort as we contemplate a shifting nature of the threat, away from something centralised in Syria and Iraq to something much more difficult for us to contain. The loss of Daesh's caliphate and falling finances, as well as thinning fighters, does not mean the issue of foreign terrorism fighters no longer exists, nor the issue of online radicalisation. Australia faces national security challenges that continue to evolve, so we keep our legislation and our capabilities under constant review to meet these emerging needs. The issue of radicalisation, particularly of young people in our country, is a very complex one. To assist in prevention of young people turning to violence, we need to engage their mothers, their fathers, their friends, their teachers, their colleagues at school. Those people who are most likely to see concerning behaviour well before it comes to our attention. Now, I'm committed to supporting communities who are at the forefront of prevention and these early intervention efforts. In fact, it's a large part of what I do as Commissioner. But when intervention fails, it has severe consequences. Since 2012, around 220 Australians have travelled to Syria and Iraq to fight with or to support groups involved in the conflict. We're well overrepresented with foreign fighters for the size of our population. Now, we estimate around 100 of them are still there, with a number of confirmed dead or believed to have been killed. In September 2014, Australia's national terrorism threat level was raised to probable. And since this time, the AFP, along with our state police counterparts, has charged 87 people as a result of 37 different counter-terrorism operations. We've also, thankfully, disrupted over 14 significant terrorist attacks, including one very well publicised in last summer for yourself in the Northern Hemisphere, when an IED was attempted to be put on a flight out of Sydney. Now, in that time as well, I'm sad to say that there's been 6 attacks in Australia, resulting in 3 Australians losing their lives and multiple people being seriously injured. Small in scale, but no less significant to the Australian community. Now, as I said earlier, policing is not about arrest statistics. Our most effective defence against terrorism is to prevent it, to prevent radicalisation, and to do something before it occurs. We've intervened early and we've diverted individuals to countering violent extremism programs to disengage from violence and to reconnect with their families and the broader community. And if we can just turn one person away from a radical pathway, then I consider that to have been a success. I might bring it to a close there. I'm sure there'll be some questions about our activities in Southeast Asia, but can I just say again to CSIS, thank you very much for the invitation today. I am a devotee of the role that think tanks play in the public policy space, and in fact, I often lament, and I'm sure Andrew will have a comment on this as well, that the culture here in the US between think tanks, academia and government in the formation of public policy is a far stronger culture than it is in Australia. Moreover, I think it's important that law enforcement officials like myself start to take the opportunities to engage the think tanks and engage in the public policy debate. Because as crime emerges, as crime develops, of course, our law enforcement response needs to keep pace, and it's not necessarily doing that. So thank you very much for the invitation. I look forward to the questions. Thank you for your attention. I think I look forward to the questions. Well done, mate.
You may regret thanking us for and telling us you were looking forward to questions.
You'll be fine.
If you've written questions down, please pass to Nick, who's in the center aisle, and Charlie over here. They'll collect them and pass them up to us. And we'll read the most lurid, I think, and difficult ones. Let me just start off, and then we'll hand over to Andrew in a second. Let me just start off with the collapse of the so-called caliphate in Iraq and Syria in particular. I mean, they've lost territory in other places. There's been a debate even in the US about how strong or weak Daesh or the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda have been over the last couple of months, with particularly Daesh's loss of territory. What does the picture look like from Australia? There were large numbers of foreign fighters going to Iraq and Syria, certainly compared in Australia's standpoint to Afghanistan or other battlefields. As you look down the road, and you started to get into this, as you look down the road, what are the most significant challenges you see as the territorial control of groups like Daesh comes down? Yeah. What's been the impact, and where are you most concerned?
Yeah, thanks, Seth. You make a good point. I mean, I can't give you a cogent explanation as to why we are so overrepresented in number terms. And while 200 Australians that have travelled to the conflict zone isn't a lot in terms of the 7,000 to 10,000 Western country combatants, it's a lot in terms of Five Eye partners in particular, and it's difficult for me to give you a reason as to why we are overrepresented, but we are. And it's quite distinctly different to what we saw with the Afghan conflict of the 80s, and it's even different to what we saw when the conflict in Syria was more about a free Syria movement, like trying to oust the Assad regime. We saw Australians involved in that who, frankly, when ISIS started to get a foothold in Syria and northern Iraq, came back to Australia, because that wasn't what they were there to do. They weren't interested in the caliphate, they weren't interested in the ideology, they were interested in what they saw as a free Syria. And I think we had less than 30 Afghan alumni from the 80s. So it's an interesting problem for us, and I think it's clear that the coalition have made incredible gains on the ground, there's no doubt about that, but ISIS is still strong in pockets, and obviously that work continues. I talked about 200 odd that have gone over. We know that probably 70 to 80 at least are confirmed killed or suspected to have been killed, and there's about 100 that we can't necessarily account for, but we have our intelligence and we have our sense of where they are and what they are doing. It presents a few problems to us. Even if the land conflict is won, and even if we saw in the next few months that ISIS footholds in northern Iraq and Syria was completely wiped out, I think the damage is done in terms of the brand and the ideology. ISIS have been extremely successful at creating a brand that even AQ weren't able to do. And we've seen them morph their MO much quicker than we've ever seen before. An example, if you look at the attempted plot to put a device onto a flight out of Sydney in your last summer, there's a number of things in that are particularly concerning in terms of ISIS reach. Up until that point, we'd seen a lot of reach into Australia from ISIS operatives trying to convince somebody to take up arms, to do something in Australia. And we've stopped a lot of Australians. Of the 200 that left, we've stopped that number many times over that have attempted to go. So we have a lot of people in Australia who, but for government intervention, would be in Syria and Iraq. Now, they're a concern. And we've seen a lot of reach back into them to try and convince them to take up a particular plot or to even an unsophisticated attack in Australia. That's a challenge enough. But what we saw with that Sydney plot was a different MO. There was no attempt to get the Australian end of that plot to do any sophisticated planning. They literally sent the ID through the mail. Now that, we could talk about the vulnerabilities that that has exposed in terms of our mail handling. But in principle and as a philosophy, the idea of actually just pre-planning it and asking them to deliver an IED scares the bejesus out of me, because it means that our opportunity to detect and intercept something is so much more difficult in Australia. We've also seen in recent times with the coalition gains in Syria and Iraq, much less of the propaganda machine. I mean, they had 2 years ago, 2016, 2015, the ISIS propaganda machine was very slick, really slick, and it was having great reach into bedrooms of young kids in Australia. We're not seeing that nearly as much, but my point is we don't need to anymore. There is that much material out there in the Internet of Things that we talk about that they don't need to keep producing. They don't need it. It is all there for people to access themselves. So I don't subscribe to the theory that because ISIS aren't able to produce the mass marketing media that they were before and the propaganda, that is less of a threat. I don't think it's any less of a threat. There is now a brand and an ideology that is almost impossible for us to tangibly do anything about, that I think is a greater threat to us. From a foreign fighter perspective, we're all struggling with the issue of what to do with foreign fighters. It's a very complex issue. It's a complex issue around statehood and the fact that citizens can't be stateless. It's a complex issue around children and husbands, wives of fighters, what to do with them. It's a complex issue around if they don't ever want to come back to Australia, and many of them, I suspect, have no intention of ever coming back to Australia. The challenge for me and the challenge for my government is we also don't want people who are Australian roaming the globe with this type of training and this type of ideology. That is also bad for brand Australia, and I have a responsibility to do something about that. The last bit I would mention on that, Seth, of course, and I didn't touch on in great detail, but Southeast Asia is a particular concern. Some of our very best partners in policing are in Southeast Asia, and there is no lack of effort or will from law enforcement agencies or the governments to stamp out the challenges that they are having with terrorism and violent extremism, but it is a wicked problem for them. And we've seen that recently in Indonesia with attacks in Jakarta, attacks in Surabaya, attacks against police constantly. We've seen it in the southern Philippines. Marawi, I think, was, while eventually they were repelled there and the Philippine government was able to take control, the fact that it took so long was a significant win for ISIS. So the challenge for Australia is not just within our borders, it's helping our near neighbours secure their borders.
Andrew, first, congratulations on the work that the AFP does. You know, the terrorist disruptions, obviously critically important, but also the less heralded work that you talked about in Southeast Asia and the South Pacific, I think is incredibly important for our interests and frankly for our allied interests as well. Could I ask a sort of two-part question about structures and some of the tools that are available to you as the Commissioner? The first one is perhaps you could just share with the audience some of the thinking behind the major restructure that's underway in Australia around our national security and law enforcement agencies. And then the second part of the question is, together we're involved in putting in place quite a few new counter-terrorism laws in Australia. Yep. But as the Commissioner, there must still be gaps. So what's the one legal tool that you don't have now that you would like the Australian Parliament to give you?
That's a good question. So thank you for your comments about the South Pacific and Southeast Asia. And first, let me say on that, I mean, that is our focus. That is our backyard. And I'm a strong believer that while we have a broad international network that works with our partners all across the globe, I have a responsibility to work with our partners in our near neighbour and our near neighbourhood. And I think it's quite right that the US agencies would expect that we've got a good handle on that, just as I want the US agencies to have a good handle on Central America and South America. And I think in fairness to US agencies in particular, there's a heavy gaze on the Middle East for good reason, and that leaves other parts of the world a little bit more vulnerable. So, you know, we are stepping up our efforts, and as I said, they're good partners. In terms of counter-terrorism reform, you're right. I mean, there has been, since 2014, when the threat level was raised in Australia, there has been, I think, 9 tranches of counter-terrorism legislation that has passed through the Parliament. Now, there's critics of that, to say that there's not a strong enough parliamentary debate in terms of those laws that have been passed and that it's eroding freedoms. I don't agree with that, obviously. I have a responsibility to protect Australians, and I do balance very heavily in my mind weighing the responsibility to be able to protect Australians with privacy, with human rights, and making sure that we've got that balance. And as a police commissioner, I think, as you know, and as others will know, behind closed doors, we're sometimes the strongest advocate on winding back legislation and ensuring legislation is appropriate to fit the needs. The biggest challenge that we've got, and I think we're grappling with, and it's not one that the government isn't conscious of, is technology. Encryption is a real problem for law enforcement. And as I said there, I mean, I'm a father. I want my kids to have encrypted apps. I want them to be safe online. I want them to know how to navigate securely. But I also see the dark side, and I see the vulnerabilities that it creates. And in a really simple sense, I think we've become very accustomed to the idea that a police officer, under proper warranted judicial oversight, can enter into a house, can enter into a bedroom, can enter into your most private realm if there's proper justification and in probable cause in a US, to use a US term. But encryption's taken that out of our range. More and more, encryption is not just used by people who want to hide their communication. It's used by, in Australia, well over 50% of communication that is just normal communication between individuals is now on encrypted end-to-end apps. That's made us, it's made a huge blind spot for law enforcement. Now we've got ways around that. We're probably going back to our more traditional methods of tradecraft in policing because we simply have to. But this is the issue that I think government needs to turn its mind to. And as I mentioned in the prepared remarks, I've long held the belief for the last decade or more that this is a wicked problem for government because government's responses to things that they want to control is to legislate or regulate. And you can't legislate and you can't regulate your way out of cyberspace. We have to work with partners. Most of those partners are here in the US. It's complicated by terribly wicked international laws that aren't aligned. And if we can find innovative ways to remove some of those barriers to speed up the process, that would be the biggest thing I think that governments could do to aid law enforcement.
Thanks. So the first question coming from the audience is, I think it has a lot of relevance to issues that we're still looking at here, and I think any Western government is as well. And that is, can you speak more on programs that get into de-radicalization, anti-violence that have been implemented in Australia? I mean, what have been some of the lessons you've looked at over the past couple of years and how you've dealt with de-radicalization?
Yeah, so look, we have quite an extensive de-radicalisation, countering violent extremism program, and I don't even know whether countering violent extremism, which is the moniker that most countries are given it, is the right way to describe this. It quite possibly is not. And I wouldn't presume to say that we have been more successful or less successful than anybody else, but in my travels around the world and looking at other programs, I haven't seen anything better, but we could improve as well, if that makes sense. What we are trying to do, there's two things with that. One is there are some programs that are best delivered by police because we are the front line, walking the streets of our affected communities, talking to shopkeepers, talking to students, talking to kids, talking to mums and dads, and we are the face of that program. But at the same time, we can be a hindrance to this as well, because when a police officer comes up to you, you're probably not always going to think this is somebody that I want to open up to and expose my thinking or to talk to in great detail. So we have to find a balance there. So some programs are delivered by police, but I think the best programs in Australia that I've seen have been delivered by grassroots community organisations. And that's several tiers below the federal government. I mean, in Australia, we've got the federal government, the state government, the local government, and within local government, we've got these grassroots organisations. They are the best programs where they're working with kids in schools, where they're working with the imams, particularly if we're talking about Islamic extremism. And we do need to be broader than just Islamic extremism. We need to understand violence in all of its forms. Working with kids before they start those pathways. but also educating parents. And I say this to parents in both a counter-terrorism sense, but also just crime generally. I encourage kids to be involved, parents to be involved with their kids' online persona. They need to know what the kids are doing. They need to know what they're doing when they're sitting in the basement late at night on the computer. They need to know who they're talking to. They need to understand that the games that they are playing, they are actively interfacing with people far, far removed from Australia, and the opportunities that that's presenting for people to have thoughts planted in their mind, to have, to start on pathways that the kids know nothing about. It's been troubling to me as Commissioner, in those 14, 15 disruptions that I mentioned, some of those were kids, and I want to say kids, 16, 17, 15-year-old, of parents who had the wherewithal and the capability to probably do something about it, but had no knowledge that their kids were on this pathway. And that troubles me as a parent, but also troubles me as Commissioner, that are we losing a whole generation simply because we don't know what they're up to? And in 99 out of 100 cases, that's not going to be a problem, but 1 in 100 is too many. And as I mentioned up there, my view on countering violent extremism, our programs, if we can turn one child away from a path of violent extremism, then it's been successful, and I don't care what it's cost.
Andrew, could we turn to another threat which you alluded to briefly, and that's the challenge posed by foreign political interference. Of course, here in the US, this is most prevalently in the news when it comes to Russia. Yep. And Russian involvement in the recent US election, continuing Russian efforts to interfere in politics across Europe. But in Australia, most of the media reporting has been about China.
Yep.
What's the AFP's role in this? And I mean, this is sort of, it's burst on the scene a bit in Australia, but obviously it's been a problem for a long time. How are you as Commissioner going to balance responding to that and your very heavy responsibilities when it comes to terrorism and other forms of transnational crime?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, Andrew, and this is a new area for us. We've always had that traditional treason offence provision. We've always had espionage provisions, but frankly, I can't remember the last time the AFP was involved in a serious treason investigation or espionage. The last prosecution goes back 30 years ago, but it's all of a sudden burst onto the scenes. And let's be honest, it's burst onto the scenes because we've all watched the US, we've all watched the narrative over here, and started to think, do we have a bigger problem in Australia? The responsibility for understanding that environment in Australia rests with my key security partner in ASIO. They're our domestic intelligence agency, and I know that they would say, as we would, that while we have been very focused in other areas, such as terrorism, over the last 15 odd years, this has snuck up. And we probably haven't invested the time or effort that we needed to into it. We haven't modernised our laws. Our treason and espionage laws were so woefully non-contemporary and didn't reflect the environment that we are seeing that we need to do something about it. Now, both the Director General of Security and myself have been quoted publicly in the paper saying that we can see unprecedented levels in Australia of foreign actors playing a role in our society in some way. Now, some of that is quite legitimate, and some of that is appropriate and is not a problem. It's about when it's discreet in nature, or about when the intention of that involvement is not stated up front, and that's the challenge we're having now. The elephant in the room for Australia is the debate has been very much about China, and I think that's unfortunate because China is a great partner for Australia on a range of things, including law enforcement, but they're also very heavily integrated in our society. I mean, they are heavily woven into our economic fabric, they're heavily woven into our business fabric, but it's not just about China. This is actually about Australia. This is about us securing our sovereignty, making sure our systems of government are protected. And from an AFP perspective, what better role could a law enforcement agency have than trying to preserve those principles of democracy and sovereignty?
Thanks. So another question is, prioritization, particularly when it comes to budget issues. And the question gets to, as commissioner, you've got to sift through a range of threats. You noted them, from organized crime to espionage issues to terrorism to many others, with limited budget. It's obviously a sensitive topic, and it's one nobody really likes to deal with. But how do you think through prioritizing a range of programs that you have, threats to the country that you have to deal with, but with a finite budget?
Yeah, well, I haven't met a commissioner in my life that hasn't asked for more resources, and I'm one of those as well. But there's a political reality to the ability for governments to fund organisations, and that's not what this is about. In fact, as I've said publicly, you could make the AFP 3 times the size it is now, and I would still have priority challenges. I'd still have to turn work away. So what we've done more recently is we've changed the way we approach our prioritisation. I'm a police force at the end of the day. I'm always going to protect property and life as my immediate priority. So anything that is about protection of property and life, no matter whether it's terrorism, child exploitation, or it's in my community policing responsibilities at airports around Australia or in the national capital, that's going to be my priority. Beyond that, there's two things that I would say that we are shifting our thinking. One is I'm an advocate for a shift in policing away from the traditional measurement of police around how many police do you have. I mean, we are constantly in policing measured by how many cops I've got. And you see that there's a political overture to that as well. I mean, it's good politics to stand up and say, I'm going to increase the size of the front line of a police force. There's good politics in that. But that's not the right question that I should be getting asked. What we are shifting to is much more about a capability model. Ask me what I can do, don't ask me how many police I've got. Because I could pour my effort and my money into frontline cops, but they may not be technology smart, they may not be technology dependent, they may not have the capabilities that they need to do the job. I'd rather focus on the capabilities. If I focus on capabilities, that then allows me to do the second part of the equation, which is make sure that the jobs we are doing, the operations that we do, are the ones that have the most impact. And I'll give you an example. And a simple example is counter-narcotics work. Australia is, as I said before, I mean, we have an insatiable appetite for illicit narcotics in Australia. Right now, it's meth. We watch very closely the trends in the US and the trend here to more opioids and the fentanyl issues. We're starting to see the signs of that in Australia, but we have a massive meth use issue. Now, if I go back to when I joined the job, a 10 and 15 kilo seizure was something that we heralded as massive. Now we've got multi-ton seizures, and we've got them on a reasonably regular basis. And when you think Australia is geographically advantaged, it's very hard to get multi-ton seizures to our country, but they're doing it, and they're doing it successfully. But organised crime is getting smart, as I've talked about with professional facilitators and their ability to go at arm's length to the actual offending. There's very little point in me arresting a couple of students who are the first people to put their hands on a shipment if those students don't know too much about it. So I could spend enormous resource on a 800 kilogram meth importation to arrest a couple of students, probably not Australian students, and achieve very little other than take the 800 kilos off the street. I'd much rather put my resources into a 10 kilo seizure if the intelligence tells me, if my international partnerships tell me that I can actually dismantle a syndicate. And that dismantling may not be in Australia. If I can use the intelligence to make sure that my partners in Hong Kong can take out a syndicate, or we have an operation that's quite well known in Australia called Task Force Blaze. It's an operation that we're doing with the Chinese authorities in Guangzhou province in the south of China. It's the first of its type. There's no other law enforcement agency in the world that's got a dedicated task force working with our Chinese partners. If I can stop the drugs before they get to Australia, based on intelligence that I've got in Australia, then I'm going to do that. Now, we have death penalty considerations in Australia, and I need to think very carefully about that as well. But it's about impact. I can't do it all. We are swamped with drugs. We are swamped with crime. I have to work out and make sure that where I'm allocating my resources is the very smartest way I can to have the maximum impact. If I can change behaviours, if I can make a vulnerability go away, if I can arrest corrupted officials who are helping with the money laundering or who are helping with transport and logistics of organised crime, then I would prefer to do that and make it harder for organised crime to operate.
We'll give Andrew the last question.
Andrew, you gave us some great figures about the vast quantities of data that are being collected these days, and thank you for the first understandable explanation of a terabyte that I've ever heard.
Someone had to tell me that.
It was good, all those semi-trailers. Could you tell us, though, a bit about how the AFP's approaching that? Because obviously that's a massive sort of analytical task. Yep. How are you working your way through that?
Well, probably clumsily at the moment. In my term as Commissioner, we've started to put a lot more energy and focus into our technical capabilities, our big data analytics. And in fact, I didn't talk about Home Affairs before to your question, which comes up in a data analytics sense. You know, what worries me about the data that we collect is, am I sitting in there somewhere in those massive terabytes, in those truckloads of papers, on something that would actually make a difference to an investigation in Australia, something that might save a life somewhere, something that might make a difference to an investigation in the US, somewhere else. There are data analytics out there that can do that for us, and increasingly it's becoming accessible. It used to be in the realm of defence, and it used to be particularly secret, and it was a national security type data. And we had access to that, but it's very hard for me to translate the national security realm to the public realm, and I need to be able to do that to do my job. Increasingly, though, that's becoming more available. So agencies like the AFP working with Home Affairs, which is the political construct in Australia now, and just to quickly answer that question, I mean, for those that don't know, we've recently changed our alignment of agencies that have a domestic security responsibility in Australia to bring them under one portfolio and one senior cabinet minister. We looked very closely at the Homeland Security model in the US, and there's some good things and some things we wanted to avoid, frankly. And we also looked at the Home Office in the UK, which is probably a bit more closely aligned to us. What that's enabled us to do is bring scale to the problem, and this is the answer to the data analytics.
Right.
The AFP by itself can only do so much. My budget is only so much, and what's the point in me developing a data analytical solution that Duncan Lewis, as the head of ASIO, need to do as well, or the head of the Border Force? So we're looking at ways that we can actually use scale and size from our portfolio now to bring it into to one realm, and we're making good progress in a short time on that. The challenge, though, is you mentioned data analytics in a community sense or a public sense, and people immediately think Big Brother. And that's a narrative that we are losing very quickly, not just in Australia. I think we're losing it here in the US. It's been lost in the UK and elsewhere because the public are very concerned about how much data sits in the hands of government. Less concerned about it sitting in the hands of Google or Facebook or your shopping centre, and I understand that because the consequence is different. When it sits with government, people automatically think, well, if the government have got my data and they've got this big analytics, have I done something that might see me arrested or go to jail? And I understand that. So we have to be more sophisticated in that narrative because we're losing that narrative at the moment. Thank you.
Great. Well, we have a tendency and interest in wrapping up when we say we're going to wrap up. So it's now time, on behalf of Andrew and the Center for Strategic International Studies, if you can join us in thanking Commissioner for coming, giving a really interesting talk, and then a really interesting Q&A session to us today. So if you can join me in thanking him. Thank you for coming. Thank you.